Okay, great. Well, let's get started, everybody. So welcome to the meeting of the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee. We have a relatively straightforward agenda today. But before we get into it, why don't we have the board members introduce themselves? And I guess I'll start. I'm Steve Raphael, Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and the gubernatorial appointee to RIPA. I'll pass it over to my co-chair, Lily.
Hi, I'm Lily Kajavi, also co-chair of the subcommittee, and I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University, appointee of the Attorney General's office. Great to see everyone here. I can't, I'm having a limited screen here, so if there's another board member who wants to jump in next to introduce themselves, that would be great.
I'm Tamani Taylor, former Chief Deputy Public Defender for Solano County, now moving over to San Francisco Public Defender's Office, and I'm representing the California Public Defenders Association as a board member.
Great, thank you, Tamani.
Trying to see Officer Randolph.
Hello, I'm Corporal Randolph, Colton Police Department. I'm the RIPA representative for PORAC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other board members here?
Not at this moment. It sounds like two are running late from other meetings, so they will join as soon as they can.
Okay, great. Thank you, Allison. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the approval of the March 10, 2022 meeting minutes that were circulated in advance of the meeting. So why don't we take a few minutes just to review those, and then if someone wants to make a motion to approve the minutes, we can go from there. Hello, Board Member Guerrero. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Andrea Guerrero with Alliance San Diego.
Okay, and we're reviewing the minutes at the moment and about to approve them, we believe, unless there's some edits. Okay, do we have a motion to approve from anybody?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Second, board member Taylor's.
Okay, so do we have a second, or did Board Member Taylor? Did you second the motion?
Sorry, I'll second board member Taylor's motion.
So I think we have to take a vote. Or maybe can we just all in favor? Allison, is that okay?
Yes, for the minutes,
Okay.
yeah, as long as we know what everyone's vote is.
All right. So all in favor of approving minutes, say aye. And I'm an aye.
Aye.
Okay, I think it's unanimous.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, and so the next item on the agenda is we're going to the overview of proposed subcommittee work and updates by the Department of Justice. And I believe Kevin Walker's going to do that presentation. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I guess I didn't test my audio earlier, but hopefully it's working. So I'm Kevin Walker with the California Department of Justice Research Center. Yes, I'm going to be giving an update on some of the work that's been going on to support the 2023 RIPA Board report from a stop data perspective. And so I'll share a presentation here. I guess I need to screen share here. That my mouse would work. Here we go. Great. So yes, I have an update on some of the work that's going on to support the RIPA Board's report with data analysis for this upcoming year's report. So an overview here. My screen froze. Okay. Okay. An overview of what I'm going to cover during the update will fall into two main areas, but I'd also like to point out that there was a preliminary draft of the stop data analysis section of the report that's in a preliminary completed stage for review and discussion by the board and to receive public comment as well. So what I'm going to focus on during this presentation is going to be the additional areas of the report that we're working towards supporting with some data analysis. And so those sections include some policy sections where we're going to be supporting the policy efforts of the Civil Rights Enforcement section and the and the policy subcommittee by providing views into the stop data on the subject areas of those sections. So those being pretextual stops as well as stops of youth. And then also at the end of the presentation, I'll also give a look forward to picking up some of the conversation where we left off at the last subcommittee meeting with regards to performing stop data comparisons to alternative data sources. And so for starters here, we'll talk about some of the policy support section work that we're doing, beginning with the pretext section. So the pretext section, we've been working on supplying content to be presented alongside some of the policy discussions. In the pretext section, there's also specific areas that are of interest for that section. There are violation types that are of particular relevance for discussions of pretextual stops. So those being, so far, bicycle violations, jaywalking, loitering. So those are specific areas in which we're looking into the data a bit deeper and providing information to kind of present alongside some of the policy and background research discussion the Civil Rights Enforcement section is working on for the policy section. But we're also doing some more general work on traffic violations as well. So as an example here of some of the things that we're looking at so far in support of that section and trying to weave some of the topic areas of discussion from previous year's reports into these sections is looking at consent-only searches within the context of traffic violations. And here we have an example of an examination of the 2021 data where we're showing consent-only searches on the left and the search rates during traffic stops for traffic violations, where we see that individuals perceived to be Black, Hispanic, multiracial, and Pacific Islander all tended to have higher search rates, where the only basis provided was that the person consented to a search, whereas all of those groups have lower search discovery rates of contraband than white individuals for the this type of search that the board issued recommendations on in last year's report, but within the context of traffic violations. So making the analysis a bit more specific to the general area of discussion for and focus for this year. So that's an example, and I'll be providing examples of other areas where we're looking at ways to incorporate RIPA data into the conversation surrounding these policy examinations. So another area where we're supporting the pretextual stop section of the report is data surrounding stops of bicyclists for bicycle-related offenses. So, for example, here we're looking at the proportion of stops of each racial and ethnic group collected within the data, where the stops were for a bicycle violation. And here we see that multiracial Hispanic and Black individuals have higher proportions of their total number of stops that were initiated for a bicycle violation than white individuals. And then we're also looking at things like follow-up actions that occurred during the course of these specific types of stops. So for bicycle violations, we see here as well that these three groups, again, multiracial, Hispanic, and Black individuals, all tend to have higher rates of being searched, detained on a curbside or put in a patrol car, and being handcuffed during the course of stops that are initiated for bicycle violations when compared to white individuals there. And so there's additional analyses that we're also looking to incorporate in each of these sections, but for the sake of being able to give you all a picture of what each of the sections is kind of shaping up like, as well as give you a picture of different types of analyses that we're including across sections. I just caution people to view these as kind of examples, that there are going to be more and they're going to be fleshed out more within the actual draft once it's together. But another area that we're looking at is stops for jaywalking within the pretextual stop section. And so again, here's an example where we're showing the proportion of stops of each race and ethnicity groups that were for jaywalking related offenses. And here we see that individuals perceived to be Black and as well as individuals perceived to be white and the two highest proportion of their stops that were reported as being for jaywalking violations. If we were to take this out another decimal place, Black individuals have just a small fraction of a percentage higher a proportion of their stops that were for jaywalking violations than white individuals there. But when we look at, say, something like these stops resulting in no action taken as the result of the stop, we see here that although white individuals had the second highest proportion of their stops that were for jaywalking, they had the second lowest proportion of their stops that resulted in no action being taken as a result of the stop, whereas we see Black individuals who have the highest proportion of their stops take place during a jaywalking violation of any racial and ethnic group in the data. They also had the highest proportion of these jaywalking stops result in no action taken. And so that's another thing that we're looking into in the data and presenting alongside some of the discussion that goes in the pretext stop section. Also looking at another violation type that's of particular relevance for discussions surrounding pretext stops is loitering stops. And so here, taking this opportunity to provide some examples of incorporating examinations of identity groups outside of race and ethnicity, although we'll also incorporate some of that information here as well. But here we can also see that the proportion of stops of transgender individuals that were for loitering violations far out. Oops, the lights are turned off. Hopefully I can still. Sorry, I'm gonna. Okay, there we go. All right. I guess it's not important that you see me right now during the presentation. But the proportion of stops of transgender individuals that were for loitering violations was much higher than the proportion of stops of cisgender or gender nonconforming or non-binary individuals that were for loitering violations. And we see a similar trend here when looking at disability type, where persons perceived to have a disability, especially those perceived to have a mental health condition, had a much larger proportion of their stops that constituted stops for loitering relative to the proportion for persons not perceived to have a disability. And so throughout the pretext stop section, the idea is to kind of incorporate references to the RIPA data when discussing these sorts of concepts and these types of stops in context. So we're providing data there to kind of make sure that as people read through the policy sections, they're still immersed in kind of the California data as well, so that we're showing the applicability of these concepts to California. And so in addition to providing those sorts of specific analyses aimed at looking at specific reasons for stop and types of violations, if we think back to last year's report that had an introductory pretext section, we were also looking at comparing moving and non-moving stops together against one another across various outcomes. And so we'd like to continue with that, and we have a plan to continue with some of those analyses to kind of compare and contrast these two types of traffic violation, and look at some various outcome measures of interest that we've looked at in previous year's reports. And in doing so, and trying to continue with those analyses, I first want to back us up to look at this screenshot taken out of the regulation. So this is a section out of the regulations that talks about stop data entry for stops that were initiated for traffic violations. So when officers initiate a stop for traffic violations, when they're entering their data, they also are going to provide the specific offense code or oftentimes vehicle code section that they initiated the stop in response to. And then also they're to designate the primary type of violation and select from moving violation, equipment violation, or non-moving violation, including registration violation. So I included a screenshot here because this is the level of detail provided in the regulations, and this also isn't mentioned anywhere elsewhere in the statute. And so when we're diving deeper into the data this year, we're experiencing some inconsistency when looking at the type of violation that officers are inputting, and when we're contrasting and comparing that for the actual offenses that they provided for initiating the stop. So I have a couple examples of here. There are many more. These are just to kind of illustrate this issue that we've encountered, where, for example, officers who initiated stops for the violation of vehicle code 5200A, which is displaying license plates incorrectly, 1/4 of the time they indicated that these stops were for moving violations, while as the other three-quarters of the time they indicated that these were non-moving or equipment violation stops, while all of them were for the same vehicle code section, which is inconsistent. Similarly, stops for vehicle code 23123A, use of a cell phone while driving, 2/3 of the time officers indicated that this was a moving violation, while 1/3 of the time officers indicated that this was a non-moving or equipment violation. And so that's, again, if we were to just break down the data, looking at moving and non-moving as entered by the officers, oftentimes what we'd be doing is comparing stops for the same, initiated for the same, I guess, vehicle code section or penal code section, and comparing them against one another, which is not ideal. We'd like to see a little bit more reliable categorization of offenses into these different types. And so we've been discussing this with Civil Rights Enforcement section and looking for, and they've assisted with providing some preliminary language for coming up with kind of a definition that we could use for the purpose of reporting this year to break down the data into moving violations and non-moving violations using the offense codes instead of the officer provided categories, being as they tend not to be consistent. And so here there's preliminary passes at some definitions to these terms that we've then used to classify stops and then break down the data and then provide analysis on. And so I can return to this slide later. I'd love to get input from the subcommittee, but I'll just briefly read through the two proposed definitions of these terms right now, which would be first a moving violation, which would be a violation of the traffic laws while the vehicle is in motion, such as speeding or failing to signal before a turn. And then non-moving violations being a violation of traffic laws aimed at correcting the improper condition of a vehicle rather than unlawful driver behavior, such as expired registration tabs. This also, for the purpose of these analyses, would include a violation of the duties outlined within traffic laws related to properly maintaining a vehicle, including broken headlights and tail lights. So also encompassing, for the purpose of the analyses, equipment style violations. So I'm hoping that we can get some feedback there if anyone has thoughts about these. Again, during the discussion portion of the meeting, I'm happy to bring this back up and share if people would like to provide us with feedback here. So in addition to analyses aimed at contrasting moving and non-moving violations this year. We're also receiving some assistance from a couple of the research associates in other sections of the research center outside of the RIPA support section, because the RIPA support section currently has quite a few vacancies, and we're a little bit more understaffed for performing all of the analyses that we're hoping to get to this year. And so Keiko Matsushita and Dr. Matthew Thompson are also helping out with an additional form of traffic violation analyses, where they're looking at, there are basically a group of about 20 vehicle code sections that constitute or represent about 3/4 of traffic violation stops within the data. So they're very high frequency vehicle code sections that are cited as the primary reason for stopping individuals in the data. And so looking at these specific high frequency offense types, there would be doing some comparisons within them across a variety of measures or outcome measures of interest that the board has talked about in previous years, such as incidents of drivers being subjected to, persons stopped being subjected to consent searches, uses of force, having no action taken, et cetera, having potentially low enforcement rates or having low rates of having the initial primary reason provided for initiating the stop match the actual enforcement action that's taken as the result of stop. So the idea here would be to look at some high frequency offense types that people are stopped for within the RIPA data, and try to identify if there are any specific vehicle code sections that tend to have high or low relative, based on the outcome measure, instances of these outcomes of interest. Because those might be areas where the board may wish to focus on for specific policy recommendations and interventions. So this is an attempt at trying to find a way to look at specific code sections and identify what might be best to focus on using the data. And so I'm excited to see what Keiko and Matthew come up with for this section. They just started on it recently, and so I'm hoping to be able to bring back results of these analyses here at a future meeting. And so that's kind of a look at the pretext stop section support analyses that we're performing or planning on performing and have performed and creating content surrounding. In addition to the pretext section that we're supporting with data analysis, we're also going to be providing some data analysis to support the youth stop section of the policy section of the report as well. And so similar to the pretext section from the 2022 report, the report that came out at the beginning of this year, where we introduced the idea of pretextual stops and provided some surface level examinations of some of the data there, the youth stop section would be like that this year. And so we'd be providing kind of introductory examinations of the data with the intent to drill further down in the next report. And so with that in mind, there have been some conversations surrounding stops of youth at schools. And so some of the preliminary information that we're looking for within the data is, how many officers are within the data that reported making a stop while working one or more stops while working a K-12 public school assignment type, which includes school resource officers or school police officers. So we see here that there were 132 officer identifiers in the data that had this assignment type during one or more of their stops. This ranged by agency. Some agencies had 0, some had up to 36 officer IDs that made stops while working this assignment type. And this assignment type was listed as the assignment type for about just shy of 1,700 stops within the 2021 data. And so we also looked at independent of, well, I guess we did some overlap too. But in addition to having officer assignment type K-12 public school, there's also a location field where when stops are made on K-12 school public grounds, officers have to indicate that the stop was made on a school. And so we looked at the stops that the K-12 public school officers made and determined that the location was listed as a school for 284 of these, so less than 20% of the stops that these school officers made were indicated as having occurred on school campus. So we then looked at overall how many stops occurred at a location where officers indicated that it was a school campus, regardless of the type of assignment the officer was working, and found that there were 1,511 cases where where the location was a school for the agencies that were reporting in 2021. And that means that less than 20% of those stops were initiated by officers who indicated that their assignment type at the time of the stop was a K-12 public school officer. And again, I think that this is going to be an area of focus moving forward into the next year of drilling down more specifically about stops that occur on school campuses and that are initiated by SROs and K-12 public school officers. So moving forward, we're also looking to support the youth stop section with some examinations of the data more broadly, looking at different age group categories, as well as looking at race within those age group categories across things like reason for stop, looking for differences in actions taken during the stop for different age groups, as well as results of stop there. So these analyses haven't yet got off the ground, but these are definitely plans moving forward, and we've been coordinating with the Civil Rights Enforcement section, see what types of analyses might best support the work that they're doing in the policy sections there. And so this kind of brings us to the end of the policy support sections as the planned analyses look right now. But I also want to follow up from our previous subcommittee meeting with a brief explanation of where we're going based on the presentation that we gave last time. So here on the screen is a screenshot of the YouTube video recording of the March 10th Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee meeting, showing the approximate starting time of the presentation that was given during that meeting on some data comparisons of the 2020 RIPA data for instances in which officers indicated discharging their firearm, and comparing those instances to instances of firearm discharges reported across other data sources for similar information, such as the use of force incident reporting database that is maintained at the DOJ under AB 71. And generally what we found there was that the RIPA data did not tend to align well with these other sources of similar information, and there were, which spoke to some potential issues with the collection and reporting of RIPA data for incidents that involved the discharge of a firearm. We heard from a little bit about agency responses to this being brought to their attention, as well as some actions moving forward that were being taken to hopefully reduce the prevalence of this within the data. So we'll be revisiting this with the 2021 data, so looking at firearm discharges and comparing that to the use of force incident database, but also not stopping there. This year, we're also planning on moving forward with comparing some of the other use of force types across databases, so between RIPA and the use of force incident reporting database, that there are outside firearms discharges, so such as canine use. So the idea here being that initially we did just firearm discharges because, generally speaking, a discharge of a firearm should be captured in both RIPA and the use of force incident reporting database. However, the use of force incident reporting database has a more constrained data collection requirement, in that agencies are only required to submit that information when the use of force incident results in serious bodily injury, death, or the discharge of a firearm for either an officer or a civilian. And so not all cases, say, where a blunt impact weapon is used will be reflected within the use of force incident reporting database. However, what we're hoping to look at this year is if we can identify any areas where agencies have reported more incidents under the more narrowly constrained data collection effort of the use of force incident reporting database when comparing to RIPA, because that would seem to indicate that there may be potential issues within the RIPA data collection for those agencies if they're reporting more incidents in the use of force incident database for a specific type of force than under RIPA. Now, there are some exemptions to RIPA data collection for niche cases, but it still may be of interest to the board, as well as agencies in the department and members of the public should know the areas in which these two databases don't tend to align well. So there's a plan for expanding that comparison effort, as well as also taking a stab at looking at internal comparisons within the RIPA data that may speak to potential data quality concerns. For example, looking at within the RIPA data at stops for traffic violations that constitute moving violations. So the assumption there is in most cases these will be stops of vehicle occupants, and then looking to see for cases where the stopped individual was arrested and taken into custody, so a custodial arrest, not an in-field Titan release, but a custodial arrest where they're being booked, where we don't see data entry for an action being taken during the stop that would seem to indicate that the person was either removed from the car by force or was asked to exit the vehicle, which are two things that logically should happen if the beginning of the stop occurs with a vehicle occupant and then the end of the stop is them being booked. So that's kind of an example of the type of internal comparisons that we're considering also taking an examination of this year. And so with regard to this section here and these types of analyses and comparisons, what would be helpful to hear from the subcommittee is just how, when we're performing these, how this might either fit in with the report or how you all would like to see this information presented when picturing the report, whether it belongs in the report or whether you want to first see it as a presentation at a meeting. So that would be helpful information for us because this is kind of deviating from some of the things that we've done in the past. This is a new approach that we'd be taking for this year. And so we're interested in getting feedback and input from board members about this proposed course of action this year. And so with that, that kind of is the end of the update. I don't want to stop for the whole meeting. There's a ton more going on and a lot more analyses that I could go into, but I want to offer enough time for people to discuss what's been discussed here, as well as the stop data section that's been circulated. So I'll stick around and be here for questions, but I'm looking forward to the discussion here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That was very informative. Maybe we can go to board members to see if we have questions for Kevin regarding the presentation. And I do have some questions, but I'll let everybody go first and then I'll go afterwards. Would any board members like to ask Kevin a question about what we just heard? Yes, Corporal Randolph.
Sir, Kevin, reference your stop data on SROs. Was that data, are we talking about those are control counters or those were counters where the officers received a call regarding the juvenile or regarding the youth? Because, I mean, I deal with kids all day long, and they come in my office to either say hello, talk, whether I'm teaching driver's ed or doing a community lecture. So I'm sure hoping that we're going to, if you guys are going to start specifically targeting that, if you're going to try to, that's going to be outlined in your data. You kind of glaze through it real quick.
Yeah, those are good things to point out. So within the RIPA data, data collection requirements are such that information shouldn't be transmitted or collected regarding contacts unless those contacts rise to the level of constituting a stop as defined by the government code section that talks about RIPA. And so these would need to be a detention or a consensual encounter that results in a search to even end up in the database. And so things like just conversations between students and SROs, right, shouldn't be captured within the RIPA data. They need to rise to the level of a stop, or there needs to be a search that occurs during a consensual encounter. So yes, those shouldn't be in the data.
Okay, any other board members?
Mine Taylor here. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Board Member Taylor. Great.
I just, not that I really can figure out why I have this question, but in the consent searches, do you guys collect both when consent is asked for and related to race, and as well as when consent is given? Because some people may not give consent but be asked, and that could have a racial disparity in and of itself. And so I was just wondering, were you just solely basing this data on people who were stopped based on race and consented, who actually gave consent based on, and broke it down based on race?
Yeah, great. That's a great question, and the answer is that we have both. The information that was contained within this presentation specifically deals with the rate at which individuals were searched after giving consent, but the RIPA data collection includes a field for officers to indicate when they ask a person for consent to perform a search of either the person or the property, and then there's also a field for them to indicate when they ask somebody whether the person consented. And then separately, actually, in another field, there's also a basis for search field where they provide the basis for them performing the search. And that's where we're taking the information that was presented here. But we have additional information. We have gone over that information in years past. Specifically last year, there was a policy section that included a lot of data analysis that looked at consent searches in more detail, and that contains some examinations of the rate at which individuals were asked for consent broken down across identity groups. And so that's covered in that year's report, but if there are specific sections that, as we're reviewing the policy sections for this year, where board members believe that examinations of, the proportion of the time where officers are asking for consent, then we can absolutely, we have the capacity based on the data that's collected to do that.
I then just echo what Board Member Taylor was saying, that, and in particular last year, that this year's analysis does cover those many strands that were covered last year. So, as a concrete example, not just was consent granted, but who gets asked to begin with. And as there are other questions that data points to, they could be included as well, but it sounds like that's the intention is, or that we could mimic. There are many questions around consent, as was pointed out. I also want to say, Board Member Hawkins, great to see you. So for everyone, I see maybe everyone else noticed, Board Member LaWanda Hawkins has joined us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for being late.
No, that's fine. We're happy to have you here. I was wondering if, as a subcommittee, we could take a look. Again, Kevin, you brought this up at that slide around moving versus non-moving violations and how to categorize those, and you gave. Start us off with two great concrete examples where maybe there's a license plate issue, and maybe that's technically an equipment violation, but on the other hand, it's on a car that was moving. Officers, you said maybe a quarter are classifying as a moving violation. I'm assuming that that's intended to be an equipment violation, but I don't know. But if we could take a look at those definitions, and then you gave the cell phone example too. Is it possible to bring that? Because it sounded like that's something you wanted us to look at specifically.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me bring that back up. Let me screen share here.
Thanks.
Here. So this is preliminary on some proposed definitions here, but would love wordsmithing, and that can occur here or via email. But the idea here would be to come up with something, because the regulations do not specifically define these terms. So it would be kind of a definition used in this year's board report to retroactively apply a definition to kind of standardize how different offense types are categorized within these categories so that we can compare and contrast them.
Well, I think this is a great idea to distinguish these more explicitly, and I'm not aware offhand, maybe other municipalities elsewhere, when they've looked at moving and non-moving violations, have made a greater distinction, but my guess is that most jurisdictions across the country, I mean, it's a much larger effort here in California statewide, but have just had some sort of checkbox moving, non-moving, and I'm not aware of this effort to go then to look at what vehicle code or other violation might have occurred, and then to make sure these are being used consistently. So I think this is great. Without any wordsmithing, I did hear you say when you talked us through these, you distinguished driver behavior versus something involving equipment. So for example, the cell phone, I guess the cell phone itself is equipment, but it was the driver behavior, someone using it while moving, that made me assume it's under moving violation. I mean, there are others here with much greater legal, so I don't know the legal lay of the land, but I just want to know, I heard you distinguish driver behavior, but in the moving violation, it's not, that wording isn't here specifically, so if you, I don't know how long you want these definitions to be. It's great if they're not too detailed, but I noticed you made some distinction in some that maybe that's something to add to moving violation to emphasize. And likewise, I heard you when you were explaining these say something about equipment. Maybe it's worth including the word equipment explicitly in the non-moving violation somewhere. I don't know if other board members had thoughts about the importance of distinguishing them or these particular, the wording that's here, or this first stab at defining them.
I did have just one thought, just so the violation of traffic law while the vehicle is in motion. If somebody's at a stoplight and checking their email or talking on their phone, that technically they're not moving, but I think we would consider that to be a moving violation because they're operating the vehicle and they're in the middle of traffic. So I wonder if there's a way to maybe incorporate in the definition something along the lines of a violation of traffic law while actively operating a vehicle, including being stopped at traffic, or maybe, I guess then we have to come up with a definition of actively operating a vehicle. So we have a definition for the definition. But, it just seems that there's a lot of violations you can do while you're parked at a light. When the automobile is on and you're sort of interacting with other drivers and you're supposed to be paying attention. I really like the idea, Kevin, of the research department, CGIS, coming up with a set of business practices that maps the vehicle codes into, you can come up with your definition, moving, non-moving, and then assigning to these categories and then, running it past, law enforcement across the state and seeing if they agree. And then using that as well, and then also comparing to how officers fill out these forms. Because I could imagine someone saying, well, they weren't moving, they were at the stoplight using their phone. And then they'd say, well, it's not moving. So you can see how it may be a mistake, but it also might be an honest assessment of kind of the conditions of the stop. But on the other hand, the code violations are probably going to be pretty precise because they have to be written out on the citation. So the idea of coming up with your own classification and then subjecting it to external feedback, I think, is perhaps a good way to go. But also providing a definition might be helpful as well in the RIPA trainings.
Right. I don't know if Civil Rights Enforcement Section has comments here about the ability to incorporate a definition into the training that's not in the regulations. I know that there have been at least mentions and discussions of that in passing. What I will say here, and feel free to jump in there, Crest, down the line. But what I will say here is that on the idea of workshopping definitions around and getting buy-in from law enforcement agencies on definitions, I think that could prove helpful in helping flesh this out. I think that the data also kind of demonstrate already the case that there may not be a consensus within the field, in that we're seeing, different law enforcement agencies and officers enter in different traffic violation types for the same codes. And so, if we are to include this sort of work in this year's report, which doesn't necessarily need to happen if we want to take a longer term approach of kind of workshopping and getting some sort of working group to go through and create this sort of crosswalk table, we could do that, but it may slow down the process in having to work through getting a lot of perspectives on this and work through kind of disagreements there. And so that could slow us down there. There may not be full consensus on all of these codes, right? There, within the 2021 data, think there are something like 600 some odd specific vehicle code sections cited in the traffic violation field. So a lot to crosswalk there, and then there are also additional code sections outside of vehicle stops in that field as well. Many of which, as we've been going through and looking at this, don't appear to fit neatly in either of these groups, moving violation or non-moving violation. For example, there's, I wish I had gotten the actual vehicle code section and prepared it in my notes here today, but a vehicle code section for stealing a vehicle or taking a vehicle without the driver's consent is less like many traffic offenses and traffic violations as we would think about them, and that they don't really have to do with the manner in which a person's operating a vehicle, the condition of their vehicle, their compliance with traffic laws, but more so is a property crime, but is defined in the vehicle code. And so there may be, and there likely are, vehicle codes contained within this field that don't fit neatly into either of these categories. And so that's another conversation that may need to be workshopped around if we take that approach. So some considerations there. I don't know if anyone else from DOJ has input here as well surrounding this definition.
Hi, everyone. So we have run this definition by experts, who work in the area of policing, and we have, essentially come up with it for the purpose of being able to do the analysis. Because if we are going to, divide up all of the, data entries and stops, then we want to make sure, we're categorizing them in a standardized way that we are then following for the data analysis. So, this does not establish the definition, necessarily, that it's more the definition is for the purpose of being able to do the data analysis and being able to do it in a way where we are categorizing, different violations the same way each time, so that we're doing the data analysis consistently. So I think if we're going to move forward with this section, which I think the board or the subcommittee would be interested in doing, then I think if there are any corrections or concerns, we can talk about it at this meeting, and we can always talk about it as a full board. But I think, for the purposes of being able to move forward with the data analysis and categorize the data, into the categories in order to analyze it for the pretext stop section, we've come up with this after a lot of, a lot of research within the vehicle codes and all of the other codes, and consulting with experts on it. So if folks have tweaks or things that they think could make it stronger, we'd of course be happy to consider those. But I think if we do want to move forward with this analysis, it's important to have a definition that we can work off of, in order to categorize the violations in a consistent way, so that it's not, we're not doing different things for different data that we're receiving, essentially.
What I'm hearing is that this year we do want a section report that analyzes these, divides the types of violations. That moving violation is sort of a broad umbrella that includes violations while operating a vehicle, and then non-moving, as outlined here. And maybe it will be that, when the analysis, which Kevin already pointed to, reveals that there are disparities in even how the forms are filled out, maybe that will translate into a policy recommendation that would then go back out, through the state, because it's critical that these forms, we want them filled out as correctly as people are able to. And even if there is maybe there is ambiguity with some vehicle code about where to place it, then it's great that we're noticing that. So Allison, I heard you saying, there's the possibility within the report of moving forward in this way, and that the first step isn't necessarily to reach out and try to I don't know, remedy or clarify or alter how the forms are filled out. And I'd be strongly in support of our still continuing to include this kind of analysis in this year's report.
So would I. Maybe could I just suggest a friendly addition to the moving violation definition, and to of course take it or leave it. But if we had a violation of traffic laws while the vehicle is in motion under or while operating vehicle, such as, and then slash or while operating vehicle or slash while operating vehicle, and then such as speeding, failing to signal before a turn, active use of a cell phone. And then it might make it a little broader, and it doesn't mean literally that the car is moving, and it might permit classification of some of those more gray area type offenses. The non-moving violation looks very clear to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Steve, because you can have a DUI if you're sitting in the car with the engine running. So I think that's well taken, Kevin.
Yeah, I also agree that that's very helpful. I think that workshopping the language to include something like that, and maybe also something to kind of distinguish that the while operating the vehicle or while the vehicle's in motion has to do with the behavior that's prohibited under the law, might also be something that would be helpful here, so that it helps, so that there's no confusion surrounding, well, their license plate wasn't on correctly, or what, they weren't displaying a license plate and their vehicle was in motion, right? And so that would seem to fit the definition of a moving violation, right? But it's not really the behavior, or sorry, the offense isn't committed because the vehicle's in motion or the way that the person's operating the vehicle, but rather the condition of their vehicle. So I think that a combination of those two things can strengthen up the moving violation definition here as well.
I just have a thought, because you're using unlawful driver behavior kind of as in the negative in non-moving violation, rather than using it in kind of the positive, or kind of the positive under moving violation. So it might be put as an example, or as like Steve was saying, in motion, or while operating. It's a violation that's dealing with unlawful driver for behavior. You know what I mean? Because if you put it there, then you don't have to have it as kind of the negative in the non-moving violation portion. It would then just be to correcting the improper condition of a vehicle, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that
defining moving violations as dealing generally with unlawful driver behavior, and non-moving violations as dealing with the improper condition of the vehicle. So I would take it out of that unlawful driver behavior language, out of non-moving, and put it in the moving violation as the definition of what you're trying to address.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that kind of speaks to, I think, my point there, but I hadn't thought about it that way before. But yeah, I mean, that would kind of make clear that moving violations have to do with driver behavior and not just that the car was moving when the violation occurred. So removing that from the non-moving, putting that sort of language in the moving violation and leaving non-moving is just defining correcting improper condition, and also mentioning that it includes equipment violations. Might be a good way to make some edits there. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
So it sounds like moving violation has moved to something like a violation of the traffic laws while operating a vehicle, such as speeding or failing to signal before a turn, or other unlawful driver behavior. Does that sound, Kevin, is that what you were heading towards?
I like the way that sounds. I'm curious if anyone at Crest also who's helped out with the definitions a lot and provided the initial drafts of these definitions, how some of the attorneys might feel about that form of the definition.
So maybe we don't need to wordsmith here, but in the end, it was including operating a vehicle, as was suggested under the moving violation, and including unlawful driver behavior here, just to make the two definitions more parallel too. Okay.
Great, no, thank you. This is I think this is the type of discussion that I was really hoping that we get to on this topic. So I think this is really helpful for us in making a kind of operational definition for moving forward with these analyses. Unless people have more comments about these, I can stop sharing the screen on this slide right now. And
I had some comments about a few other things, but is there any further comment on this before we move on to other aspects? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that, Kevin. I think that's really great. I had just a kind of, these are minor things, but just some food for thought, I guess. In the conversation about pretextual stops, where we're looking at jaywalking and consent-only searches and bicycle stops and loitering stops, the main outcome seemed to be the proportion of stops that were characterized as, the category that we were looking at, whether it's the loitering or the jaywalking. And I wonder, just reading the results this morning, the analysis, amazing how constant they are from year to year. But there's big differences in the base stop rates between groups. So, like we have African American stops, 15% of total stops, but 6% of the population in the cities. And then white stops are a little lower, and Latinos are about equal. And, so it seems that if 1% of your stops is, say, for a bicycle stop, but you're stopped at 3 times the rate of your population, that comparison might kind of miss that. So, so it still might be the case that one group gets stopped a lot more on a bike than another group, but because they're stopped more, generally speaking. And I know for a lot of these subgroups, it's hard to come up with a base population. That's like there's nothing in the census that would allow you to identify, transgender women. But for some there are. But it might be worthwhile to maybe reference in discussing those proportions the work in the other part of the report that's talking about the general overrepresentation and what does it mean for 1% of stops of African Americans to be for bike stops, and if it matches that for whites when there's a big disparity in the likelihood of stops overall. So that's just kind of a minor point. And then I guess I had one other question, one other point. Oh, I think the internal consistency stuff. So I don't really see this as a problem, and I think it's a really healthy thing that DOJ is sort of looking for ways to see, whether there's external comparisons that match the data and what that reveals. And then I think the internal issues, that I think that's a good idea, is if somebody's arrested, they had to have been taken out of the car somehow, so one of those things should have been filled out as well. So I think in general that, I know in other organizations, like in the Census Bureau, they continuously look for problems. It's just part of the way they do business. And in fact, oftentimes when they invite researchers to use their data internally and confidentially, one of the things that they require the researchers is they have to sort of articulate, well, how is your project going to help us do a better job? So, I think it's good to do that, and we shouldn't be scared of finding that, oh, that question doesn't work. Just, it's better to know than not to know, and then try to figure out how to fix it. And in that vein, the one thing I was wondering was, Do we have any idea when the new regs regarding the new questions are going to be asked and maybe separating the questions into different categories and the pull down tabs and things like that? Do we have a sense when that will go into effect? And in particular, I think the separation of the use of force actions from the other actions during stops, or maybe that's already gone into effect and perhaps it's improved things.
Does anyone that's working on the regs packet have an update on where that's sitting?
So Nancy, do you want to speak to that or? Okay, I'm not sure if, so the regulations are still with OAL, Office of Administrative Law, so they are not approved. They have not been given final approval yet, so we're waiting on that. So we're still basically waiting at this point. So they've not gone into effect. If OAL does approve the regulations, which we hope they do, they will, then they will go into effect, I believe it's January 1st, 2024.
And
Yes,
does that mean
and
that?
yes and no.
And well, there's a piece, yes. Okay, Nancy, I'll let you explain since you're more.
That's okay. Yeah, so there's so we've asked that the piece where researchers can request the data through the DOJ protocol to be effective immediately. And then the data elements themselves, the reporting requirements would, as Allison pointed out, would be January 1st of 2024 in order to let everyone have basically a year and change to update the systems and get any kind of training that needs to be done. And so we did do another, we had sent them to the Office of Administrative Law. They had some things that they wanted us to clean up. We did another public comment period at the end of May. And those were the ones that we submitted to the Office of Administrative Law in mid-June. And they have 60 working days in order to approve them. So we are waiting to hear back. But we are, given that we had already submitted those regulations and had been working with them to incorporate their feedback before we posted the second, I guess it's the second 15-day public comment period, we believe that they will be approved. And so that is the timeline.
Given that, and I realize it's a very long process, but I heard that it might be as late as January 2025 before statewide, then consistently the new variables are coded and so on, or that the way the RIPA data is collected is modified. So maybe, Kevin, maybe with that in mind, I think it's really important and great that this year will be an analysis looking at specific violations, because currently for many of the questions we look at, let's say driver and pedestrian, not to mention cyclist, small fraction of stops, but are all grouped together. And in fact, it's possible that for many stop outcomes, including searches, that what happens during a vehicle stop and what happens during pedestrian stop can be very, very different. And the distributions, who's affected by those types of stops. I mean, at least historically in LA under the consent decree, that was the case. And so and we may not be able to tease that out as much except by looking at specific violations. Even looking at moving violations, okay, then those will involve, we'll know that those involve drivers and not pedestrians. So I think it's really important that we're moving forward with this, more detailed dive into the data, even as narrow as specific violations or groups of violations. Steve, you had asked about this. Was there more that you were going to add?
Maybe one more question. Just so supposing that the regs are approved and I guess it's a little in the weeds, but I think relevant to this committee. But if the regs are approved in January and then there's a year to have everyone get up to speed, change their forms, is there, I mean, should we be thinking about an effort regarding advice on what the form looks like, on maybe how the elements are ordered within the question? Like, so for example, I think in use of force, we should follow the continuum from, lethal on the bottom and then less lethal in severity, all the way to the top. And I think that might be kind of maybe psychologically, officers might look at it and sort of know that the really serious ones are at the bottom, the less severe are at the top, and then answer more correctly, or be careful not to scroll down to the bottom and pick the one when it didn't happen. And it does seem like there are other things like that, like even in terms of the actions, perhaps some thought could be given, and then advisory sent out to the localities, because we know that to some degree, if I understand correctly, that the departments are kind of have a little bit of leeway in terms of how they structure their data collection processes. Or is there room within the regs to kind of do that, not necessarily tinkering, but thinking about the best way to present the choices with an eye on improving accuracy?
So that's something that Kevin and Erin and the civil rights team have been working on, and we'd be happy to present that to the subcommittee, at the next meeting, because there's pros and cons to doing different things, to doing different ways. I did look at it in terms of, before we submitted the second public comment period, and then I felt like I was maybe just going down a rabbit hole a little bit, because there's different ways to do it. And so I think maybe we could present those to the subcommittee. One of the things that we're kind of leaning toward is, what do we say, Kevin, alphabetical by incident, because it kind of makes sense to also, Steve, to like potentially, like, if you have, a firearm, to maybe group all of the firearm, pieces together, instead of like trying to figure out, is pointing a firearm less severe than tasing someone, or whatever it is. I think it'd be great to have that discussion when we have something prepared, and we can share that with the subcommittee. And I think Rich was raising his hand.
I think that's a great idea. Okay, Rich.
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to point out, so I've been on, since we just started doing RIPA entry for my agency, I've been going on ride-alongs with other agencies as well, seeing their formats. This is a major adjustment for law enforcement. I know everyone on this call understands that. That's why we're here. And I would hope that they would take into consideration that it's time consuming. That's why I've encouraged some members to go on ride-alongs and entry happen. So as we continue to layer this out for the individual officers throughout the state, no matter if there are 21 cops or 7,000 cops, we want them to embrace this change. Some agencies have kind of got a streamline going right now, and if we change it every year, Steve, I'm glad you pointed out there's like a rollout period, kind of like a training period for agencies to adjust. I think right now the big adjustment is everyone in the state's doing it. So I'm just hoping that this subcommittee would take that into consideration. It's a training thing for all the cops in the state that are using it. That was all.
Yes, thanks for that. And I do think, Nancy and Kevin, that laying out the questions in a way that ensures accuracy, that makes it easy to go through, is part of data quality. and can have an impact. That, you know, it's something really worth thinking about. So a separate presentation on that, and it's great. I'm glad to hear that you're thinking about that. And I mean, quickly, there's lots of ways to do it, right? And I'm not sure which one is the best or what have you, but it might be worthwhile us having a discussion about that at some point. I think if we think of this, you know, maybe one of our responsibilities seems to be trying to think about ways to improve quality. It seems to clearly fall under that, right? That having the form be clear and easy to understand and to avoid mistakes is a good thing. And then, of course, we can't change it every year for the reasons that were just cited.
No, and you know, Rich, I think the idea that Steve is proposing, and which Kevin, Aaron, and I, and the team are all kind of working on, is to make sure it's easier for officers to complete the form, so that they're not, you know, it's not sort of counterintuitive. And just so that you know too, I mean, the regulations were initially published in 2017, and the second set was, you know, by and large done because of questions and input from law enforcement and improvements that we saw that we thought needed to be implemented. And then, you know, we're giving it that extra year and change for agencies to get their systems up to speed, and so that we can do that training. But, you know, the hope is once the new data set is, you know, fully functioning and people are collecting that, it will help streamline and clear up some of those, you know, issues that we've seen in the past. I'm sure it'll create new ones that we didn't foresee for the future, but for now, the hope is that this will make things better.
Great. Okay, so those were my questions. Do board members have other questions or comments on the presentation or anything we've discussed so far?
I just had one question about whether or not maybe in the past or if it's not been done in the past, would it make sense, and is there a possibility of doing this, of evaluating the length of stops, because that could have its own, like I said, racial component or sexual orientation component, things like that. You know, where you're finding that, you know, a certain population is being detained longer or stopped longer under the same kind of scenario, right? Talking about bicycle stops, car stops, consent searches, are they, you know, because those things time can be used as kind of a way of harassing people, and, you know, I think it's something that we, all defense attorneys, are always paying attention to, is how long was my client detained before there was ultimately a consent, you know, so it kind of timing the length of time of a contact with a police officer, yeah, I think has a significance. And so I don't know if we've ever collected that data or if it is impossible. I mean, I know I deal with CAD logs and things like that, so I know there's a way of evaluating how long it was. But yeah, I think that was my.
That's a great point. And to answer the question about whether there's information about kind of duration of stop, how long stops took, yes, there is. That's a field that's collected under RIPA. It's measured in minutes, how many minutes the stop last. Right. I know that under the revised regulations, there's some changes there to, I think, clarify what the end cutoff point for what constitutes when people should be measuring the time until when entering the data. And so I know that there's some improvements coming down the line to standardizing that practice some more, or at least making it explicit within the regulations. But there is a duration of stop variable in the data currently. So for each stop, officers enter in, it took this many minutes to complete the stop. We won't have information on, like, say, it was this many minutes from the beginning of the stop to the point in time when officers ask for consent or something like that, which may be able, which in some contexts and some forms of documentation, you could probably figure that out. But within the RIPA stop data, it's not specific enough for us to know that when specific elements or actions were taken at what point in the stop. But we do have the stop durations. And so it is possible to incorporate analyses there. And I would like to find some areas where the subcommittee would find those sorts of examinations to be interesting. So if subcommittee members have specific areas that they're reading through, as they're looking through the report, or if they're looking at, policy sections that have data analysis included in them in future versions of the draft, and you say, oh, well, this is interesting, right? But I'm also curious about how long these stops take and whether that differs based on stop context or identity group. That would be, I would really encourage y'all to reach out and let us know so that we know where we can kind of focus some of those analyses. I think another thing worth mentioning is that some of the time with finding ways to display those sorts of things kind of lends itself well to, regression models looking at, how either a stop context or an identity characteristic might have an effect on the duration of stops, kind of as an outcome measure. But when we've tried to think about ways to present that information in the past, we've kind of encountered that it can get complex for the given audience for this report, which is general public and it's not an academic audience. And so thinking about ways where you all might think of ways to present that sort of information in a way that's easily digestible. If there's any ideas there, we'd love to hear about it. But yeah, absolutely, that we do have data, so we can do that, and the quality, hopefully, of that data will be improved after the new regulations go into effect, where there's a very defined, this is when the stop duration starts, and this is where you measure the end of it in the new regs.
I think that's a great point that was raised. Thank you, Board Member Taylor, that we haven't made explicit use of the duration data, partly for the reason, Kevin, you said there might have been, this is where the clock sort of started at the beginning of a stop, and then if someone was detained, the entry in that field looks very different. It doesn't represent just the time of the traffic stop itself. That's important to note, but it might be harder than to measure. The only thing we've done, I would say, is looked at search disparities, and obviously if there's a search or something else that extends a stop, that's a rough proxy potentially for time. Maybe as a first step, Kevin, it sounded like you were open to there's bandwidth to start looking at duration of stop, maybe as you're looking at specific violation codes, given a certain violation, say moving violations, to look at with respect to race and ethnicity, duration of stop explicitly. I think that could be very important. So I'd like to echo the interest in looking at.
Yeah, no, I think that you pointing out a specific area where we might be able to incorporate this in an initial pass is very helpful when thinking about kind of those discussions of those 20 offense codes that tend to account for a large proportion of traffic violation stops. So maybe looking at amongst those other outcome measures that we'd be looking at, like whether they involve consent searches, right? We'd also look at maybe average duration of stop there as well to see if there are specific offenses there where we see longer durations of stops. That might be another consideration there. So that gives me a place to start when thinking about this for inclusion before. So thank you for that.
Mitch?
Hey, sir, and for the panel, just I understand what Jelani was saying. I totally agree with what she's keying in on. Instead of the panel actually doing a whole revamp on how we're doing that, a simple solution to this would be pulling the call for service of wherever that individual was stopped. I mean, once I get out of my car, I make contact with someone, I actually have to block out that timestamp. So that is available to anyone, let alone the body worn camera, which activates when I do make contact. So I just thought I'd throw that out there instead of reproducing extra data. That extra information could be gotten from the individual person that was contacted.
That sounds like an idea for a potential way for some agencies, maybe based on their systems, to implement a way to kind of capture duration of stop natively based on the technology that they have access to that might record that, right? The body camera footage is this long, and then importing that into their data set. Yeah, I mean, the regulations, I don't think, govern exactly how agencies are going to build their systems to account for that information. I don't know if anyone from CSP or CREST has any thoughts there about whether that would be an acceptable way for agencies to kind of program their systems, but that would be an interesting way of trying to reduce the amount of manual data entry that officers have to produce for collecting stop data.
Lily, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I finally figured out how to raise my hand following the nice example of fellow board members. But I just on a slightly different note, in the past, there have been questions about an interest in looking at how mental health crises are handled, and this is an area where we already see specific agencies or municipalities starting to make changes. And so I think this is something where the data can shine a light, and maybe this is really a topic for the policy subcommittee too, if there are ways that we can point out either what's happening or what could be happening. Maybe as a concrete example, West Hollywood, which is surrounded by Los Angeles but has it's working with the sheriff's department, is increasing the number of what they're calling ambassadors on the street, and as opposed to increasing the size of the sheriff's department number of deputies. But so for better or for worse, the ambassadors, their training includes training for dealing with mental health crises, and so there's clearly, and it's clearly, I think, public interest in changing how mental health crises are handled or have been handled with law enforcement, and so I think this would be a really important area to look at. I don't have at hand a specific data question. Others on the board may want to weigh in or add to this, but that's something that's it's not in the current pass through of ways we're looking at the data, but it's really a critical issue.
Board member Lawanda would like to weigh in on the ambassadors with the mental health. I think that's an awesome idea for them to be used like that, but I'm concerned about public safety. When we send the ambassadors out like that, we still have to send law enforcement with them, just for their protection and the community protection. And so when they say that, I think they need to tell the whole story. In certain areas, you have to have law enforcement with the ambassadors. Just like when the paramedics come in certain areas, they're not allowed in certain areas without law enforcement. And the ambassadors are the same thing.
I can just comment. The Calls for Service subcommittee is actually looking at different crisis intervention models and doing some updates from last year's report on outcomes of those models that we've been looking at, and examining ways in which the state is also working on some of the crisis intervention with bills around crisis intervention mental health hotline 988 and some other areas. And so the Calls for Service group subcommittee is looking at different crisis intervention models. And as you pointed out, Lawanda, whether law enforcement does need to get called or not, what the models look like. Some of them have law enforcement involved. Some of them are totally independent of law enforcement and only use law enforcement to call for backup. So there are different models, that are being examined around the state and looked at. I would say, Lily, if you do have any specific data questions around calls for service and areas, that you think are really important to highlight. I know there's a short section right now on the Stop Data draft on calls for service, which is similar to what we've done in the past in terms of breaking down, by race. But if there are specific questions you have that, we can also discuss with the calls for service subcommittee, please. Definitely, we'd love to hear them.
Okay.
Just one more. Sorry, during that time I was looking up the text version of the proposed revised regulations, and I think that also in future years, post the implementation of the updated version of the regulations, there will be, the additional field added for officers to indicate whether a stop was made during the course of performing a welfare check or serving a community caretaking function, right, which may encompass many of these stop contexts that kind of involve some of the crisis intervention teams. And so once we start collecting that sort of information, it may expand our ability to kind of identify some of these stop-submitted data, which are somewhat difficult under the current data collection protocols. So just another thing to look forward to post-revision and I guess the build up to collecting those new data fields.
Okay. Are there any other further comments from board members? All right, well, that was a good discussion. Why don't we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the public comment period. So we hear from our community members participating today. So I think we're small enough that if people just raise their hands, I can just call your name out on the list. Rather than, so would anybody like to make public comment at this time? West Tech Environmental, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Is my mic on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Anthony Beltran with West Tech Environmental. I'm a public person. I was wondering if it's possible for people who are in the public to volunteer to work on some of the subcommittees, or is it are all those positions appointed as well?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that all the board members are appointed members, and all the board members are populating the subcommittee.
Oh no, I mean that not. I know that they're appointed by to be board members, but on subcommittees, do you have regular people working with board members on subcommittees? Is that something that's an option that's available?
The subcommittees are set up from the board members, and the composition of the board is set by statute, and so the subcommittees are drawn only from the members of the board. But every subcommittee meeting, there is the opportunity for public comment. And so that's where members of the public are welcome to weigh in and provide any feedback or comments.
Okay, just so I can be clear on this, if I have a suggestion or an idea that I want to float to the board, do I do it through the board or do I do it through a subcommittee?
You can do it through either, because all of the meetings of both the board and the subcommittee are open to the public and provide comment periods. So you can provide it to the subcommittee for their consideration. You can also attend the full board meeting, which is actually scheduled for next week, July 28th, and provide your public comment there as well. So you're welcome to provide it at either or both the subcommittee meeting and the full board meeting.
And finally, I don't want to hog the time, but finally, if I submit information or suggestions, that won't necessarily make it to that meeting. So should it be like, is there a period of time that I should submit the documents or information prior to the meeting? Is there a period of time, like a week or so that it can be on the agenda?
The agendas for the subcommittee meetings are set ahead of time, but there is, you are welcome to submit public comment. We can put it in the chat, but there is a mailbox, an AB 953 at doj.ca.gov. We'll also add that to the chat, but that is also a mailbox for the RIPA board work where you're able to submit public comment. And we share those public comments with members of the board or the subcommittee, depending on who they're directed to.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Would anybody else like to make public comment? So just hit the raise hand button.
If someone is joining by phone, is there a way that they can also indicate that they'd like to?
They could just unmute and tell us. That'll. Okay, so seeing no further public comment, why don't we move on to the next item agenda, which is discussion of next steps. So I'll just try to summarize what happened. So that was, thank you for the presentation, Kevin, and for entertaining. And I know you're on the hot spot a little bit. Everybody's asking you a million questions. You always handle it so gracefully. But it sounds like a couple of concrete next steps might be some revisions according to the conversation of the definition between moving and non-moving violations, and then adding to the next stop data subcommittee some discussion of item ordering and question design with an idea of making it easy and reducing the likelihood of mistakes. And I think that's it. Was there anything else, Lily, that I missed? Or DOJ staff, is there something that we should add on the next steps list?
I want to add that the presentation that we saw that gave us a window into the sections that are going to be coming into the draft is extremely helpful.
Certainly was.
I'll just those sound great to me as updates that we can circle back on during the next subcommittee meeting, as well as hopefully coming back with some updates surrounding the planned analyses that are going into those sections and taking under consideration areas where we can implement some suggestions from board members during this meeting, such as talking about the proportion of time when officers ask for consent, in addition to talking about the actual consent search rates where appropriate, as well as taking a look at where we can implement a duration of stop as an outcome measure, potentially in that section where we're looking at top 20 offenses, so we can focus in on specific offense types there. So we can come back with some updates there, hopefully at the next meeting, as well as come back and hopefully by then depending on when that meeting gets scheduled, we'll hopefully have updates on some of the preliminary comparisons of the RIPA data to the use of force incident information that we'll be able to keep you all apprised of at that time. So, but yes, no, these next steps are in line with my notes as well. Thank you.
Before we close out, would any board members like to make a final comment for the afternoon? No? Okay, everybody's good. All right, well, just thank you, DOJ staff, for your presentation and your hard work. Your just continued diligence to trying to make the data better and sort of fueling and staffing this effort. And to our board members and my co-chair Lily for a great meeting, and to the members of the public for showing up time after time again. We appreciate your participation. And I think we can adjourn our meeting. So thank you everybody for your time, and we'll see most of you next week at the full board meeting.